Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's FDU Alumni Webinar Series, sponsored by the FDU Alumni Association and Office of Alumni Relations. We hope that everybody who joined us tonight is doing well and staying healthy. I want to take a moment to let everyone know this webinar is being recorded so we can share with folks who couldn't be with us tonight. So just to let everybody know, if you do have any issues being recorded, that's what we're doing, so make sure you hop off if you're concerned about that. I also would like to, before we get started, share some tips for an optimal viewing experience for tonight's webinar. Your microphones have been muted upon entry, so please make sure to keep them on mute throughout the presentation. We also ask that if you not have already done so, that you turn off your cameras. In order to best view today's slideshow, we recommend minimizing your participant screen and moving it to the bottom right corner of the window. This can be done by hovering your mouse over the window, clicking on it, and then dragging it down to the bottom. And you'll see some options on how you can personalize the size of your screen on the bottom. So that'll help you be able to see the slideshow. After the presentation today, we will be having a Q&A session. Some of our questions have already been submitted, so we will get to those questions, but we also want to encourage anybody who may come up with a question throughout the presentation to please feel free to submit it via the chat feature. And the chat feature can be found by hovering your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you'll see a little chat icon. So if you have any questions throughout, please feel free to just click that and submit it, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can in the time allotted. Thank you, everybody. At this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Karen Lewis, the Associate Vice President for University Advancement.
Thanks, Jennifer. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for another informative webinar presented by the Office of Alumni Relations and FDU's Alumni Association. If you were not able to join us last week for Dr. Dale Caldwell's webinar, The Small Business Stimulus, the Good, Bad, and Ugly, you will find that presentation on our alumni website, as well as Dr. Albatroni's, and this will be posted there as well. We encourage you to visit that. You will also receive tonight, after the presentation, a survey. If you would please take a few minutes and fill that out, would appreciate that. And mark your calendar for next Tuesday, April 28th at 7:30. Dr. Dan Casino presents Masculinity, Threat, and Politics. Tonight's webinar is presented by Dr. Peter Woolley, the founding director of the School of Public and Global Affairs and professor of comparative politics. He was the Florham campus provost and co-founder, and for many years, the executive director of Public Mind. His research in public opinion and his political commentary have been cited in news outlets from the Sydney Morning Herald to the Washington Post and Trenton Times, from NJN to CNN, and in newspapers from Alaska's Ketchikan Daily News to the Miami Herald. Dr. Woolley took over the direction of Public Mind in 2002 and nurtured it from an obscure startup in polling to a nationally cited source of public opinion on campaigns and elections, as well as on a variety of national issues such as automobile safety, eminent domain, gambling, the impact of candidates' gender on voters, and even the impact on New Jersey of TV shows such as The Sopranos and Jersey Shore. Dr. Woolley has been the principal investigator in hundreds of projects associated with Public Mind. Tonight's webinar will not only answer your burning questions about polling, but it will also keep you engaged. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Peter Woolley.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks to Jen Troxel, thanks to Ken Lamb and Sherver, thanks to Rick Reese's entire team. I'm delighted to be in this webinar, and I'm delighted that all the alumni and many friends are here with us tonight. And I'm going to present this webinar in 3 parts. And we're going to look at polling fools as an adjective and a noun and a verb, and a verb and a plural noun. And that will become more evident to you in just a few moments. I want to echo Jen's encouragement that you use the chat function if you have a question along the way. And I also want to warn you that we're going to have a few polls ourselves. And in fact, just to warm you up and get you going, we're going to launch a poll right now. Jen, you want to ask the first question? Okay.
Absolutely. So you should all see on your screen a poll. Please let us know by choosing your answer. I registered for this webinar without difficulty, with some difficulty, or with a lot of difficulty, or you did not register for this webinar.
Right. So what this says is if you've wandered off to wash the dishes or cook, I think you're going to want to come back and you're going to want to stay close because there are going to be 9 other questions and we're going to want to share the results with you each time. Okay? So then let me use the title Polling Fools in this way. We are a bunch of polling fools here in the polling world. And these polling fools are entirely necessary. And I hope I'm going to convince you of that by the end of this session, that polling is really a key linkage between public opinion and public policy. And it is something that strengthens democracy in lieu of having constant elections. We often criticize politicians for following public opinion, but in fact, the system is designed in large part to be accountable to public opinion. So let's take a look at our first question here. Now, some of you in advance asked the question, well, you know what, Jen, maybe we should ask our second poll before I go to the next slide.
You got it.
So the question is, were the polls accurate in the 2016 presidential race? And judging by the people who posed questions before this seminar when they registered, a lot of people out there think that the polls were not accurate in the 2016 race. So rush to your screen, cast your ballot, so to speak. And right now we're showing about 75% of our viewers say the polls were not accurate in 2016. So let's take a look at what those polls actually look like. All right, so I hope you can now see my screen. And if you look at my screen, what we have here is a handful of polls that were done in the last week of the race. We want to stop sharing the poll results, get those off our screen.
You got it.
And on this slide, you see the final results for Clinton at the very top with 48% of the popular vote, and for Trump, 46% of the popular vote, and the spread was about 2 percentage points. The rolling average of the final public opinion polls was 3 points. So what we're saying here is these polls, which by the way are estimates, often within plus or minus 3 percentage points or 4 or even 5 percentage points, were on average just 1 percentage point off from predicting the final national vote, right? Now, in fact, the only poll here that you could say was really wrong is the second one on the list, right? IBD TIPP tracking said Trump had a 2 percentage point advantage. That turned out to be wrong. That's a polling organization, by the way, I'd never heard of. It's the only one I'm aware of that got things wrong. Everybody else got it right. Because as you know, this is not really a national election. These are national polls which are being reported, and these national polls are accurate. But in a very important sense, we don't actually have a national election. We have a state-by-state election, a federal election, right? So what's important is really not, at the end of the day, whether Clinton bested Trump by 2 points in a national poll, but whether or not somebody gets a majority of the electoral votes, which are counted state by state. And in most of those states, of course, the allocation of electors is a winner-take-all proposition. All right, so let's take off the table that the polls were wrong. We might say that you forgot your civics lessons, that people who were reporting the election to you forgot their civics lessons. It's not really a national election. It's a state-by-state election. We could phrase the question in a slightly different way. What happened? How about that? What happened? Now, in a very close race, as this was in many, many states, in fact, there are a lot of explanations you could use for why somebody lost Wisconsin and somebody won Florida. In a race where the candidates are really very, very far apart, there's usually just one or two good explanations. But I want to ask you, if you're still at your screen, tell me what's missing on the screen. If you look very closely at these poll results, tell me what is missing. Have a look. And I'm sure Rick has another $1,000 check ready for the person who gets it right. So I'm going to tell you what's missing.
Stop bankrupting me, Peter.
What's missing here, if you look in the column from left to right and add them up, what's missing here is a number of percentage points. So look at the Bloomberg line, for example, reporting percentages of 44, 41, 4, and 2 for Clinton, Trump, Johnson, and Stein, respectively, right? It's short 9 points. There are 9 points missing from that. Where are those people? What are they doing? Why are they not being reported here? And the answer is they were undecided when the pollsters interviewed them. Now, I'm sure these pollsters are just like FDU pollsters. And I know Jamie Gergadis is in the audience here. Give him a shout out because he's helped us out enormously over the years. And those missing people then are typically pressed. If the election were held today, who would you vote for? And if they say they can't make up their mind, they're asked 2 or 3 more times. At the end of the day, it's very important to press that point. If these people go to vote, they are not going to vote undecided. They are going to vote for somebody. Now, typically, we find that in many elections, what happens to the undecided vote by rule of thumb is that it goes in 3 directions. It'll go about a third for the Republican, about a third for the Democrat, and about a third don't show up to vote. But in some elections, of course, that pattern is broken. In some elections, you see undecided voters breaking for one candidate or another in a disproportion. Typically, when that happens, people will break, undecided voters to the end will break more for the perceived challenger than for the perceived status quo candidate. So I would submit to you that Hillary Clinton was perceived as the status quo candidate. Trump was perceived as the change candidate, as the here's something different candidate. So it's not surprising then that independents in many states, many key states, including Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, broke in disproportion for the challenger rather than the perceived status quo candidate. All right, but that's not all. That is not all. Before we leave the slide, let me just emphasize in every one of these polls, there are people not being reported in this polling aggregator. Let's take a look at something else though. Let's take a look at what was happening in the last week of the election. Now this is a slide that shows you net favorables. That means we ask a question, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of this or that candidate? What we then do is we subtract the unfavorable from the favorable percentages, and that gives us the net favorable. All right, so Hillary Clinton starts the last week of her campaign, you can see, with a 14-point net favorable advantage over Donald Trump. As the week progresses, what happens is that her net favorable advantage almost collapses. By the end of the week, her net favorable is only 5 points. Now, this makes no difference whatever for committed voters. It's not showing you that Democrats changed their mind or that Republicans changed their minds. It's not showing you that Clinton supporters suddenly decided not to support her. It really presaged the fact that independents were going to break more for the perceived challenger than for the status quo candidate. So this last week of campaigning was disastrous for Hillary Clinton. And by the way, by the end of the week, there were several people predicting, several notable people like Nate Silver predicting that that Clinton was on an inalterable downward trend and would lose. Okay, now I'm sure you've got plenty of questions on that, but we're going to move on for the time being. We're going to move on to a different topic altogether. Jennifer, I think this topic deserves a new poll. Can you give us a new poll?
You got it. So in general, how do you approve or disapprove of allowing a bear hunting season in New Jersey?
Okay. There's a lot of movement in those numbers, right? Come back from the dishwasher you were loading and make sure that you let us know, do you approve or disapprove of bear hunting season? Okay. Well, now let's see what that looks like. Jen, can all our viewers see what I'm seeing? Can they all see that it's about?
Yes, they are all currently viewing the results.
Okay, good. All right, then. We can stop sharing and see what the poll looked like when we asked this in New Jersey in a statewide, what we call probability sample, okay? So we polled this question periodically over the years because, as you probably know, this is an important and somewhat impassioned discussion in New Jersey from time to time. In 2011, we measured that 49% of New Jersey voters statewide approved the notion. And in this slide, I've also highlighted some very important differences, which pollsters are really there to report as well, and always do. Whether they make it into a newspaper or a website is something else. But you can see here that men, for example, are far more likely to approve of a bear hunt than women. You can also see that people in the youngest age cohort, under 30, are far more likely to disapprove of a bear hunting season than people in older age cohorts, right? And finally, I want to point out to you, just as undecided voters are important in a campaign, unsure voters are also important. You can look down at the bottom of your screen and see that in this case, almost 1 in 5 voters really didn't know. Now, I'm telling you this because pollsters with integrity, which is most pollsters, try to be very fair and try to point out all the nuances. There are people who have different idea. So, for example, we can ask the question this way. Jen, let's ask it the way we were asked to ask it. Can you launch the next one? Do you want to read that, Jen?
I apologize. I was on mute. I'm here and I'm ready to read.
Okay.
During New Jersey's previous black bear hunts, hunters were permitted to shoot cubs as young as 10 months old, and mother bears with cubs, some of whom may still be nursing. Do you support or oppose New Jersey allowing the shooting of bear cubs as young as 10 months old?
Okay, everybody, let's vote on that one, huh? I'm predicting a very different outcome, and there it is. Now, in fact, this is a true-to-life story. FDU poll takes on private clients. We do not poll for parties, but we do poll for interest groups under the condition that we have the final say over how the question is worded, and even if they own the data, if we think that they have abused it in some way or misrepresented it, we reserve the right to make a public correction. So in this case, someone from an interest group came to us and asked if we would ask this question in this way. We said no. She took her money elsewhere. And in fact, when this was published in the press, many outlets refused to report it. Some did. And it didn't turn out much differently than it did in this audience. In other words, it's not really, this is a question which aims to push the respondent in a particular direction, and it did so very successfully. There are a lot of people upset about our results, and I have to say I've gotten a lot of criticism over the years, but this is some of the criticism that stuck with me the longest. Jen, can you read this letter from a young and upset poll reader?
How would you feel if you come home and found a bunch of strangers eating your food and messing up your house? Bet you'd be mad. You'd probably call the police. Maybe that's how bears feel when humans are in the forest, only they can't get police help.
Yeah. Now, it's not uncommon, by the way, for people to criticize pollsters, not because they're wrong necessarily, but because they don't like the results. This happens all the time. We get kickback from candidates, we get pushback from interest groups, we get pushback from Second Amendment champions. This is actually, turns out, one of the side effects of polling, that you will be criticized by people who simply don't like the results. So let's look at polling fools then in a slightly different sentence, right? Polling fools people. And we want to say this in two ways. Sometimes it fools people in, let's say, a bad direction, like that question about bear hunting that was loaded, so to speak. And sometimes we fool people purposely in order to conduct an experiment and actually get more at the truth. So I'm going to take you down memory lane here for a minute. And we're going to look at the election in New Jersey in 2009. You might remember some of these people. There was the incumbent governor, John Corzine, who had a very difficult term, first because he was in a car crash that took him really out of office for many, many months. He was unable to work. But then also because at the end of his term, he was deep into a recession that had nothing to do with him, but that's the fate of incumbent governors during recessions often. So that unemployment was at 10%. He drew not one challenger, but a bevy of challengers, and the race was cast as a three-way race. And the third party, of course, was this man in the center, Christopher Daggett, who had spent a career in public service, had a very respectable resume, and in fact, had a number of advantages. He qualified for public spending. It was predicted that he would easily be able to spend over $1 million. He would be included by law in broadcast public debates, and he was a credible person for sure. So there was a great deal of excitement then about this possibility that a third-party candidate would actually poll well and might even win. And so, as things unfolded, it was quite a ride. Now, Jen, I want to ask people about their own party affiliation. Can we launch the next question? And I should reassure everybody that this is completely anonymous. We can't trace you, and we don't care. But we do want to ask this question about partisanship. Okay. So the important thing in this slide right here in this question you just answered is that 3/4 of the viewers have a partisan preference, right? Okay. Now, Jen, do you want to launch the next question? The next question is about your views of independent candidates. In general, would you like to see more independent candidates in elective office? Okay. We have some active voters here. I really like that. And in general, about half of you would like to see more independent candidates in elected office. And the rest of you are split between no and not quite sure what that looks like or how that happens, right? All right, so now if we go to my slide, I'm going to stop sharing that, if we can. And we're going to look at this trend line in measurements of vote preference for Daggett. Now, for a third-party challenger, this was pretty exciting, right? You can see in the center of the slide that his measurements were touching 20% at one point. 20%. And that was quite the media splash. But there was something fishy about it, we thought. As trained political scientists, we thought, this is not really the way things work. Something here is just not right. And there are quite a few things that sparked our interest here. Now, one of them is this ballot that you're looking at. If you can see that ballot, right, this is not untypical of New Jersey ballots. In New Jersey, it's important to know that ballots are arranged by county clerks. So each county clerk, generally speaking, with a few exceptions, gets to determine where the candidates' names are on the ballot. Now, if the county clerk and the party of the candidate of his party are the same, then they're going to get the best real estate there is on the ballot. That's the top left corner, right? So you can see in this ballot, Governor Corzine gets the top left spot. So the question is, where are the other independent candidates? Can you find Christopher Daggett on this ballot? And if you can, you don't need glasses. But our thought was you cannot educate people where to find him on the ballot because he's going to be in a different spot in every county. And he's going to be in an unfavorable spot in every county. And it's going to be difficult then for voters, even those who know his name and want to vote for him, to suss him out. There were other problems as well. And that is that his name recognition was really not as strong as that of the two major party candidates. And in fact, spending $1 million in a New Jersey campaign is just not a lot of money because we are in two of the most expensive media markets in the country. New Jersey doesn't really have a media market, right? We're really between New York and Philadelphia. So our last supposition was that the difficulty in measuring the independent candidate was that people were identifying the independent candidate as the independent. In other words, Americans have a little bit of a romance with independents. They like to see themselves often as independent voters. Even if they identify themselves as Republicans or Democrats, they often like to think that they're not partisan. Our supposition was that simply reading the candidates' names and identifying one as the Democrat, one as the Republican, and then one as the independent was inflating the independents' vote preference. And the question was, how do we show this? The answer now is on my screen. So the answer was, we would pick a different independent candidate, an obscure one who was on the ballot but who never ran for office before. And instead of reading Christopher Daggett's name, we would read this guy's name, Gary Steele. And we would identify him, at least through half our sample, as the independent. We would, in the other half of the sample, identify Christopher Daggett as the independent. And so the experiment then says that the difference between those two measurements would be the actual measurement of Christopher Daggett. Let's take a look at how it came out. Okay, so you can see, I think on the right of your screen, a column that says Daggett red garnered 17% support. Steele red, as the independent, garnered 12% as the independent candidate. Now, they're not being read, of course, to the same respondents. They're being read to different respondents. And the difference between these two results then is 5%. Not coincidentally, that is exactly the percentage share that Christopher Daggett had in November after all the ballots were counted. Well, here's another one. I think it's time to ask this audience, Jen, if they would vote for a woman for president. All right, so we have quite a few people weighing in at this point. There's some people doing the dishes and not voting. We'll call them non-voters. And we can stop sharing this now because we see that 96% of this audience, this viewing audience, says, yeah, they would vote for a woman for president if she were qualified. Now, that is exactly the word choice for that question going back to the 1930s. It's been asked by the Gallup polling organization for many decades now. And you can see by this slide that the answer, yes, has gone from under 40% in the late 1930s to the mid-90 percentile in the last decade or so. Right? Now, is that true? Is that true? Would all these people really vote for a woman for president if she were qualified? We think that's fishy too. We think that when you ask people certain questions, they have a sense that there's a right answer and a wrong answer sometimes. And this is one of those questions that suggests there's a right answer. And so we call that the social desirability effect, right? People answer a question the way they think they're expected to answer it, or they answer it in a way that they think will reflect best on them, rather than reflect their real behavior. So what we showed in several studies was that this was a dramatic overestimation of people's willingness to vote for a woman for president. And how we showed that was, again, we have split samples. For one sample, we asked a question which we did not ask to the second half of the sample. both halves of the sample got the same preference question about candidates. Would you prefer Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton? That was run, of course, way back in 2008. And in 2016, the choice was between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. But the one half of the sample was asked this question in addition, and were asked this question before they were asked anything about vote preference. And the question was very simple. It was this: do you or your spouse make more money? Now, we didn't care whether they were married, and we didn't care what the answer was. We cared what effect that would have later on in their vote. That is to say, their vote preference. And what we showed is between one sample and the other sample is that people who were primed with the question, who makes more money, you or your spouse, were far less likely to have a preference for Hillary Clinton than the other sample that was not asked that question. The first sample was far more likely to have a preference for Donald Trump than the second sample, which were not asked that priming question. Fascinating stuff. So the answer to your question, does it make a difference for Hillary that she was a woman? Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. So now let's go on to something less controversial, huh? Jen, launch our poll about Jersey Shore. What's the question then, Jen?
Is your opinion of the MTV show Jersey Shore favorable or unfavorable? Or have you not heard enough about it?
Right. Now, it's not surprising, is it, that most people have an unfavorable view of Jersey Shore. The next question would be, well, do you think Jersey Shore as a show helps or hurts New Jersey's image? And when that was asked by one of our rival university polls, actually, they showed that people not only had this hugely unfavorable view of Jersey Shore, but they concluded very quickly that it hurt New Jersey's image. And in fact, that was a message echoed by many public figures in New Jersey. And so the Jersey Shore cast and the Jersey Shore show became widely criticized by public leaders. But we had a very different idea about how to go about this. We were quite sure that the first question made the second question unfair. If you have an unfavorable view of the Jersey Shore show, you're almost certainly, aren't you, going to conclude that it must hurt New Jersey. But we did something different. We asked first, in my next slide, we asked first, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of New Jersey? Right? Then we asked, had you seen or have you never seen the show Jersey Shore? Right? So what we find here, I've circled, right? If you've seen the show Jersey Shore, then you are 3 times more likely to have a favorable than an unfavorable view of New Jersey, right? If you have seen the show, you are 50% more likely to have a favorable view of New Jersey than people who didn't see it. And I want to point out the very important last column too, right? It's that undecided column, that don't know, not sure column, very important, right? You can see in that column, if you have seen the show, you're much more likely to have an opinion about New Jersey than people who had not seen the show, right? And in fact, if you've never seen the show, you're twice as likely as people who had seen the show to say, you don't really know. whether you have a favorable or unfavorable view of New Jersey. Ergo, you can conclude that in fact, Jersey Shore helped New Jersey's image, probably not because of Snooki and JWoww, but probably because it was advertising the Jersey Shore. Now, we're going to go on to just one last thing, and then we can field some questions. The question is also often posed, how smart are these voters? How well informed are they? Aren't we, when we're polling, just polling a lot of fools out there? And that is a very important question for democracy, isn't it? Right? We all have a very strong notion that being well informed is intrinsically good, and that being well informed makes us better citizens, and being better citizens makes us better voters. But then we have these doubts, right? We have these doubts that perhaps people just aren't well enough informed, right? And I want to give you this quote from Walter Lippman, who wrote about public opinion a century ago. Walter Lippman was a very popular columnist, but also a very, very accomplished academic. And he said this about public, likening them to theater goers. The public will arrive in the middle of the third act and will leave before the last curtain, having stayed just long enough to decide who is the hero and who is the villain of the piece. Now, he wasn't running down the public. Lippman was really making an observation that it's incredibly difficult to be well informed. In fact, we have in our minds somewhere an ideal, well-informed citizen, and we can't live up to that. Lippman pointed out that even he, a PhD from Harvard in government, whose full-time job it was to follow government affairs, could not have a well-informed opinion on everything there was to have a well-informed opinion about in government, at the local level, at the county level, at the state level, at the federal level, in the legislature, in the executive departments, in the judiciary, in the hundreds and hundreds of cases that come to be decided by the Supreme Court at the state level or at the federal level. What we have here is a very, very difficult task we've idealized and then want people to live up to. How realistic is that? Now, this is the crux of it then. When we go to have an election, it's a very, very blunt instrument, right? We're faced typically with two candidates, two parties, two policy platforms, and all we do is get to say one thing, this column or that column. It doesn't express what we really think in any complexity, does it? And it doesn't allow us to take our vote back the following week or the following month or the following year, right? So elections, in that sense, are a very, very blunt measure of public opinion. And of course, campaigns are very, very blunt instruments of gaining public opinion. So what can we do about that? And the answer is, sometimes we can provide the link between people and their government through good polling. We can make up for the blunt instrument that is electioneering by having a much more precision instrument called polling. Now, what you see before you is the Revel Casino in Atlantic City in 2011. And as you can see, it was unfinished at the time. It was unfinished because investors had simply run out of money. And holding the mortgage on that was Morgan Stanley. And there were a lot of people in New Jersey, in Atlantic City, who wanted to get that project going again. And to get it going again, they would have to sell it to investors. The talk then was, can we make this deal happen by offering tax abatements and tax incentives to the next owner. And so there was a big conversation and a big push on to offer a package that would sweeten the deal. Now, we thought this was a little fishy too. After all, Morgan Stanley is the note holder and is the seller, and therefore we're really helping out the seller by offering tax incentives, right? Is it the job of New Jersey to offer those incentives? Maybe it is, because if the property is sold, then then thousands of people will go back to work. But when we asked New Jerseyans what they thought of that, in fact, they didn't like it very much at all. 61% opposed the idea. When that became known in New Jersey through the media, that was pretty much the end of the deal. And in a big surprise ending to the story, it turned out that the buyer that they wanted to give the sweet deal to was actually the Chinese National Import-Export Bank. We asked the same question about American Dream several times. As you know, that mall stalled several times. It was actually known as Xanadu the first time we asked about it. And we asked voters whether to facilitate the sale and to get new investors, the state should invest money in the form of tax credits and incentives. And again, voters said quite decisively, that's not a good idea. And as recently as 2014, I want to point out, we asked a very innocent question. In a national poll, we asked, is the National League, the National Football League, a nonprofit organization or not, as far as you're aware? Naturally, most people said, no, that's not a nonprofit organization. But in fact, it was, and had been since the 1960s in a special exception or provision made in order to facilitate what was then the National Football League with the American Football League. And it had retained that nonprofit status right through 2014, even though the CEO, Roger Goodall, was making $44 million a year, and many of the people who worked for him were making seven-figure salaries. When that became known, the National Football League withdrew its nonprofit status. Let me make an important distinction here, by the way. The league is the business office. It's not the franchises. The franchises, everybody understands, are for-profit entities. In any case, the conclusion here I want you to draw is that polling can be a precision instrument to not just to measure public opinion, but to guide public policy. And that is very much needed between elections. So call me a polling fool, say that polling fools, but don't just say we're polling a bunch of fools. The public opinion is what makes the country go. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. We have one more poll for you, and then we're going to take questions. So if you could just run to your screens and let me know the answer to this final question. We're going to take a few questions. All right. So Jen, do you want to launch a question at me?
Absolutely. First off, I want to say thank you, Dr. Woolley, for your presentation. I think it was both enlightening and engaging. It was fun to see everybody fill out the poll results and really be able to participate in the topic. So moving on to the Q&A portion. Our first question is coming from Corey Manis, an alumnus from 2007. How has the transition from landline to mobile phones changed public opinion research methodology?
Corey, that's a great question because it's been really a revolutionary shift in the way Americans use the phone and the way they answer the phone. And of course, it's been a very difficult change for pollsters to grapple. If you can imagine, there was a time when people only had landlines, and when the phone rang, someone in the house answered it and they took it seriously. Now we know that that world is long gone, kind of like Xanadu. But pollsters have adjusted in a number of ways. One is that they do contact people by cell phone. Now that's very expensive, so that's the downside. We still sample landlines to some extent, but for the most part, we have shifted our in-person interviews to cell phones. We don't use robodial because, as you know, that's illegal. The length of the interview is often the same, but at the same time, just finding somebody who will answer the phone is that much more difficult. It also makes the math at the back end that much more difficult, because at the end of the day, what we want is a sample that looks very much like the voters or the public in general, whether they vote or not. That has certainly given a lot more work to statisticians to work the sample and try to make it conform better to the general population, the parameters of the general population. Of course, it's also sparked all kinds of virtual sampling, internet sampling. There's a company called YouGov that grew out of Stanford University that constructs what they call parallel samples. So everybody's adjusted, but I have to say it's far more complicated than ever before, and causes a lot more nail biting than ever before. What else you got, Jen?
Thank you, Peter. This question was submitted via the chat, and this question comes from Dr. Mark Mirowitz. Can you explain how margin of error is generated, and why doesn't The Economist have a margin of error?
I'd have to look at The Economist, Mark, to know more about that. But typically, I'll tell you this. The margin of error is a very particular formula. It's not very complicated. But what it does suggest, and what is very important, people always forget this, is that a poll is a scientific method to arrive at an estimate. So polling is scientific, but the results are a mathematical estimate of the general population. Now, when we say estimate, right, we frame that in by saying we think, this is typically how we present it, statistically, 95 out of 100 times, if we ran this experiment again, we would come up with similar results. That is to say, similar results within a few points, and that's the margin of error. So let's say, for example, the margin of error is plus or minus 3 percentage points. What we're saying is basically 19 out of 20 times, if we run this experiment properly, we're going to end up within 3 points of our original conclusions, our original estimate. Now, of course, what that means is the 20th time, we're going to be outside our estimates, our original estimate. So in polling, there is a statistical recognition, not only that this is an estimate, but that a certain amount of time you will have what we call an outlier. You will have a poll that is simply wrong. And that will be 1 out of 20 times. I'm not sure what the deal is with The Economist, but I can tell you that it's not correct to calculate a margin of error with a poll that is considered not a probability sample. So not a probability sample means that there's not an equal chance of people participating in your interview or your questionnaire. And it means that there's no way you can really generalize from that population to a general population. So for example, when the Office of Advancement, after this talk, sends out a questionnaire, only some of you will answer that questionnaire. And there's really no way to be confident that the people who answer the questionnaire are also representative of the people who didn't answer the questionnaire.
Thank you. Our
What
next
else?
next question is also via the chat. This question is from Jillian Shipley. Is there an average number of people to make a poll usable, especially as it relates to presidential election polls?
So that's a good question because it relates directly to the previous question by Dr. Mirowitz, and that is that the number of people in your probability sample is really determined by how much a margin of error you can tolerate and how much money you have. So if you have a sample of 400, really that's enough for a pretty darn good estimate. However, your margin of error will be plus or minus 5 percentage points. If you kick that up to 600 respondents in a probability sample, you'll reduce that margin of error actually by 2 points to plus or minus 3 points. Beyond that, there's no way to eliminate the margin of error unless you ask every single person in the general population your question. But generally now, I can say the media generally likes to have 800 in a sample. And for pollsters, what the 800 does in our favor is it allows us to look more carefully at subgroups. So the larger your sample, it doesn't really change, let's say, your what we call the top line estimates, right? The aggregate estimates. But it does allow us to say something much more particular about different groups. We can compare Republicans with independents, with Democrats with more confidence, men with women. We can compare racial groups much more statistically confidently. So that's really the advantage of the larger sample, is to look more carefully at groups inside those inside the population.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Woolley. I think due to time, we have time for just one more question. So
Okay.
I'm going to throw this last question at you, and it's from Vicky Stampoli. If people do not behave in an impulsive way when answering a poll, then isn't that bias? And how do we correct for that?
Vicky, that is a beautiful question. Political psychologists would love that question. And by the way, you're going to hear a very good political psychologist next week, Dan Casino. So the answer really is people are impulsive. People are impulsive. Now, when we poll, we're really measuring their impulses. And is that biased? No, that's the real people. There's a whole school of thought, which I subscribe to, by the way. I've come to subscribe to, I should say, that says people make up their minds about candidates long before they have anything to say about it. They make it up their minds up really in their gut. The decision of what party to choose, what policy to like, what candidate to vote for is somehow made at the visceral level, and everything else is a rationalization. Now, for a lot of civics book proponents, that's a very disappointing thing to hear or to contemplate. But I have to say, in polling, it has brought a great deal of precision to the science, relying on those impulses. So
Okay.
thank you very much for that question, Vicki. I appreciate it. And I thank everybody who tuned in tonight, and I hope you'll come back next week.
Okay, thank you again, Dr. Woolley. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you all for attending tonight's webinar. And please keep an eye out for an email. We'll be sending it. It's probably in your inbox right now. So if you could give us some feedback on this webinar, as well as maybe some future topics you'd like to see, that would be great. Thank you again for joining us tonight. Thank you again, Dr. Woolley. I hope everybody stays safe and have a great rest of your evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jane.